At my daughter's wedding, her husband called me a worthless immigrant loser. I'm James Anderson, and I'd stayed quiet for 2 years. What Brandon Miller didn't know was that his fancy investment banking firm paid me $2.3 million in rent every year. He didn't know I owned 38 downtown office buildings, including the one where he worked. Tonight, his arrogance would cost him everything he'd built. Because when you humiliate a billionaire who's been hiding in plain sight, the consequences come with compound interest. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single document. My hands didn't shake. My voice stayed level. But the paper I held would end his career in 72 hours. If you're watching this, please subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Have you ever been underestimated because of how you look or sound? Here's how a quiet immigrant taught an entitled banker that respect isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn and lose. 2 years ago, when Sarah brought Brandon home for the first time, I knew we had a problem. He walked into our modest 3-bedroom house in Cedar Park, Texas, and I watched his eyes do a quick scan. The worn leather couch I'd had for 15 years, the small TV mounted on the wall, the family photos showing me in work clothes, concrete dust still on my boots. "So, Mr. Anderson," he said, settling into our recliner like he was interviewing me, "Sarah tells me you're retired from construction work." The way he said construction work made it sound like a disease. "Built houses for 35 years, I replied. "Good, honest work." Brandon nodded with that smile people use when they're trying to be polite about something they find disappointing. That's admirable. Manual labor is so important for society. Sarah shot me a look. She knew that tone. Over the next 2 years, the comments got more frequent, more pointed. At family dinners, Brandon would steer conversations away from my stories about job sites and building projects. When I mentioned fixing something around the house, he'd joke about blue-collar solutions. When Sarah's friends visited, he'd introduce me as Sarah's dad, who worked construction. Never Jim, never by name. Just Sarah's dad, who worked construction. The worst part? Sarah started doing it too. "Dad, Brandon's colleagues are coming to dinner," she'd say. "Maybe wear the blue shirt instead of the flannel." "Don't mention the duplex rentals," she'd add quietly. "They might not understand." What she didn't know was that those duplex rentals had grown into something much bigger. At their engagement party last spring, Brandon gave a speech to his Morgan Stanley colleagues about marrying into a humble working-class family. He talked about how it would ground him and help him remember his values. 200 people applauded while I stood there, holding my beer, feeling like a museum exhibit. "My father-in-law taught me that honest work comes in many forms," Brandon said, raising his glass toward me, "even if it's not in a boardroom." The laughter was polite but pointed. I could have spoken up then, could have shown him the business cards in my wallet, the property deeds in my home office, the Forbes article from 2018 that called me one of Texas's quiet titans. But I didn't. Why? Because Sarah loved him. Because she was happy. Because I remembered what it felt like to be 28 and trying to build a life. When I came to America from Ireland in 1983, I had $340 in my pocket and a thick accent that made people assume I was uneducated. I'd learned to stay quiet, work hard, and let my results speak for themselves. For 40 years, that strategy had served me well. But tonight, at the Fairmont Austin Hotel, surrounded by 180 wedding guests, Brandon Miller was about to learn the difference between staying quiet by choice and staying quiet because you're weak. The reception was in full swing. Sarah looked beautiful in her grandmother's pearls and the $3,200 dress we'd bought at Nordstrom. The string quartet played soft jazz while guests mingled around tables decorated with white roses and gold accents. I'd paid for the wedding, all $85,000 of it. Brandon's parents had contributed exactly nothing, citing cash flow issues from his father's recent retirement. But as I watched Brandon work the room, introducing Sarah to his colleagues and superiors, I heard the same pattern over and over. This is my wife, Sarah. She comes from a modest background, but she's incredibly driven. Sarah's father is a simple man, salt-of-the-earth type. We're so different, but opposites attract, right? Each introduction made my chest tighter, because what Brandon Miller didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the quiet man in the corner, nursing his whiskey and watching their expensive suits, owned the building where half of them worked. As I stood at the bar watching Brandon introduce Sarah to his managing director, Patricia Wells, I faced a choice that would define the rest of my relationship with my daughter. Stay quiet, and Brandon would continue to diminish me for years to come. Our family dinners would remain exercises in subtle humiliation. My grandchildren would grow up thinking their grandfather was just the construction guy who couldn't understand their world, but speak up, and I'd risk destroying Sarah's marriage on her wedding night. The stakes were crystal clear. Sarah had worked at Dell Technologies for 3 years, building a solid reputation in their corporate development division. She was smart, capable, and ambitious, but she was also married to a man who introduced her as coming from modest circumstances, like she was a charity case he'd rescued. If I stayed silent tonight, that narrative would become permanent. Brandon would spend the next decade explaining Sarah's humble background to justify why she deserved opportunities. He'd position himself as her generous savior, the successful banker who looked past her simple family to see her potential. And Sarah gradually would start believing it. I'd already seen it happening, the way she'd apologize for my presence at their engagement party, the way she'd change the subject when I mentioned business, the way she'd started saying we're different kinds of people when talking about her childhood. My daughter was disappearing into Brandon's version of her story. On the other hand, revealing the truth tonight would shatter everything Brandon had built his identity around. His colleagues would discover that the humble immigrant he'd been condescending to for 2 years was actually their landlord. His managing director would realize he'd been disrespecting a major client, but it would also humiliate him publicly on his wedding night in front of 180 people, and Sarah might never forgive me. I thought about my wife, Margaret, who'd passed 5 years ago. She'd built our family's financial foundation alongside me, managing the books while I managed the properties. She'd been the one who insisted we keep our wealth quiet. Let Sarah have a normal childhood, Margaret had said. Let her earn her own respect. We'd driven 10-year-old Toyotas while owning $200 million in real estate. We'd shopped at Target while tenants paid us 7-figure rents. We'd lived modestly while building an empire. Margaret's strategy had worked. Sarah had earned her college degree without financial pressure. She'd landed her job on merit. She'd developed confidence and independence. But Margaret had also said something else near the end. If anyone ever treats our family with genuine disrespect, you show them exactly who they're dealing with. Tonight, Brandon Miller had crossed that line. As I watched him laugh with his colleagues about marrying down, I realized that staying quiet wasn't protecting Sarah anymore. It was enabling her husband's arrogance. My silence had become permission, and Brandon Miller was about to learn that my generosity had limits. I finished my whiskey, set the glass on the bar, and walked toward my briefcase. Inside were documents that would change everything: property deeds, lease agreements, and financial statements that told the real story of who James Anderson actually was. The question wasn't whether I should use them. The question was whether I'd let my daughter spend her marriage apologizing for where she came from. The moment came during the cocktail hour, when Brandon was holding court with 5 of his Morgan Stanley colleagues near the champagne fountain. I approached their circle carrying my briefcase. Brandon saw me coming and his expression shifted. That look people get when an unwanted relative approaches during important business conversation. "Dad," Sarah said, appearing at my elbow. Brandon's just talking shop with his team. That's fine, I said quietly. I'd like to introduce myself properly. Brandon's laugh was nervous. Actually, Jim, we're discussing some pretty complex financial instruments. Might be a bit over your head. His colleagues smiled politely. Patricia Wells, the managing director, glanced at her watch. Try me, I said. Dad, please, Sarah whispered. Brandon's smile widened. He was enjoying this. Okay, we're structuring a $400 million commercial real estate acquisition. Multi-property portfolio, very technical stuff. Interesting, I said. What's the cap rate? The smile faltered slightly. Excuse me. Capitalization rate. Net operating income divided by property value. Basic real estate metric. One of his colleagues, a younger analyst, looked impressed. 6.2%. That's decent for Austin, I said. What class properties? A, B, or C? Brandon's jaw tightened. Mixed portfolio. Mostly Class A office buildings. Downtown core or suburban? Mix of both. I nodded thoughtfully. I know that market pretty well. Really? Brandon's voice carried an edge now. And how exactly would a construction worker know commercial real estate metrics? The circle went quiet. Sarah's hand touched my arm. You'd be surprised what you pick up, I said. Brandon turned to his colleagues with exaggerated amazement. Isn't this fascinating? Jim here thinks he understands our business better than we do. Patricia Wells looked uncomfortable. Brandon, maybe we should... No, this is great, Brandon continued. Jim, since you're such an expert, maybe you should give us investment advice. Tell us which buildings we should buy. His colleagues shifted nervously. This was getting awkward. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a simple white business card. You might want to look at the Anderson Properties portfolio. Brandon took the card without looking at it. Anderson Properties? Never heard of them. They own some interesting assets downtown. Like what? I met his eyes directly. Office buildings. 38 of them, actually. Brandon glanced down at the card for the first time. His expression changed as he read it. James Anderson, CEO, Anderson Properties, LLC. The color drained from his face. Wait, he said slowly. This is your company. That's right. But you're... He looked around at his colleagues, who were now staring at the business card. You're a construction worker. I was. For 15 years. Then I bought my first duplex in 1987. Patricia Wells stepped forward, her expression shifting. Mr. Anderson, did you say Anderson Properties? Yes, ma'am. She looked at Brandon, then back at me. We've been trying to get a meeting with Anderson Properties for 6 months. They own half the buildings we lease space in. Brandon's hand was trembling slightly as he held the business card. This is impossible. What's impossible? I asked. You can't own Anderson Properties. They're worth about $1.4 billion, last appraisal. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. Wedding guests continued chatting around us, unaware that Brandon Miller's world was collapsing in real time. Dad? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. I turned to her with the same calm expression I'd worn all evening. Yes, sweetheart. Is this real? Very real. Brandon was staring at the business card like it might catch fire. But why didn't you ever... Never came up. Never came up? His voice cracked. You let me think you were just a... Just a what, Brandon? He looked around at his colleagues, who were now studying him with professional curiosity. Patricia Wells was clearly recalculating everything she thought she knew about this conversation. I don't understand, Brandon said weakly. It's simple, I replied. You assumed. I didn't correct you. But the house? The clothes? The truck? I like my house. My clothes are comfortable. The truck runs fine. Sarah was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. Dad, why didn't you tell me? Your mother and I wanted you to build your own life, make your own way. Brandon's colleague, the young analyst, cleared his throat. Mr. Anderson, we've been trying to contact your company about leasing opportunities. Do you handle tenant relations personally? I smiled. Depends on the tenant. Brandon made a choking sound. Patricia Wells extended her hand. Mr. Anderson, I'm Patricia Wells, Managing Director at Morgan Stanley, Private Wealth. I believe we manage some investment accounts for Anderson Properties. That's right. Since 2019? Brandon looked like he might faint. The first round was over. 20 minutes later, Brandon pulled me aside near the hotel's marble staircase, away from the reception noise. His confidence was returning, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. He'd had time to think, and thinking was dangerous for a man like Brandon Miller. Jim, I need to understand what's happening here. What's to understand? This business card. This company. He held up the card like evidence. I've never seen you in any real estate circles. Never seen your name in the Austin Business Journal. I keep a low profile. Nobody keeps this low a profile. His voice was gaining strength. A $1.4 billion company doesn't just hide. I could see him building a case in his mind, looking for the flaw, the explanation that would put me back in the box where I belonged. Maybe you're partners with Anderson Properties. Maybe you do maintenance work for them. Maybe you should do your research before you decide what's possible. But Brandon was already pulling out his phone. Let me just verify a few things. He walked to the corner, his fingers flying across his screen. I watched him search, scroll, frown, search again. After 5 minutes, he returned with a puzzled expression. I can't find much about Anderson Properties online. Just basic corporate filings. No executive profiles. No media coverage. I told you, I keep a low profile. But there's one thing. His eyes lit up with what he thought was victory. Forbes mentioned an Anderson Properties in 2018. Some article about quiet titans. But they didn't use any photos. Just called the owner a reclusive real estate investor. So here's what I think happened. Brandon's confidence was fully restored now. You saw that article? You had this business card made. You're playing some kind of elaborate joke. I looked at him steadily. Why would I do that? Because you're embarrassed. Because you want to impress my colleagues. Because you can't stand that I'm successful and you're not. The accusation hung in the air between us. Brandon! My voice stayed level. What's the address of your office? What? Your office at Morgan Stanley. What's the address? 221 West 6th Street. Why? Nice building. Granite lobby, 32 floors. Yeah, so you pay about $87 per square foot for that space. Prime downtown location. Brandon frowned. How could you possibly know our rent per square foot? Lucky guess. But I could see the doubt creeping back into his expression. Because that number was exactly right, and there was no way a construction worker should know it. The lease runs through December 2026, I continued, renewable for 2 5-year terms. Your firm occupies floors 18 through 22. Brandon's face went pale again. How do you? Property management is detail work, but you'd have to be. What? He couldn't finish the sentence, because to know those details, I'd have to be exactly who I claimed to be. Meanwhile, Sarah had been watching this conversation from across the room. She approached us with Patricia Wells, who looked like she had something important to say. Dad, Patricia was telling me about Anderson Properties. Patricia Wells smiled professionally. Mr. Anderson, I hope you don't mind, but I called our office to pull your account information. Brandon straightened. Here it was, the proof that would expose my lie. Our wealth management division handles approximately $340 million in investment accounts for Anderson Properties, LLC, Patricia continued. The account was opened in September 2019. Brandon's mouth fell open. We've been hoping to expand that relationship, Patricia said. Anderson Properties has been one of our most sophisticated clients. Very conservative investment strategy. excellent returns." "You're serious," Brandon whispered. "Completely serious." Patricia looked confused. "Brandon, you told me Sarah's family was from a modest background." Brandon's eyes darted between Patricia, Sarah, and me. The pieces were clicking into place, and the picture wasn't one he liked. "I need some air," he said suddenly. But as he started to walk away, Patricia called after him. "Brandon, wait!" "There's something else you should know." He stopped. "Your office building, 221 West 6th Street. We've been negotiating a lease renewal on behalf of one of our real estate clients." Brandon turned slowly. "What client?" Patricia looked at me, then back at Brandon. "Anderson Properties owns your building, Brandon. They've been your landlord for 2 years." The blood drained completely from Brandon's face. "That's impossible." "I have the documents in my car if you'd like to see them." Sarah was staring at me with a mixture of shock and something else I couldn't quite read. Pride, confusion, fear. "Dad," she said quietly, "is she telling the truth?" "She is." "So every month when Brandon goes to work?" "He goes to work in my building." Brandon sat down heavily in a nearby chair. "This isn't happening." But it was happening, and it was about to get much worse, because Brandon Miller had spent 2 years disrespecting the man who owned the ground beneath his feet. And now, in front of his managing director and his new wife, he was learning that respect isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn, and something you can lose very, very quickly. The question was whether Brandon was smart enough to recognize his situation and apologize, or arrogant enough to keep digging his hole deeper. Based on everything I'd seen over the past 2 years, I suspected I knew which path he'd choose. The moment I knew there was no going back came during the toasts. Brandon had retreated to the bar after learning about the building ownership, but instead of processing the information and adjusting his behavior, he'd started drinking, heavily. By the time dinner was served, he'd consumed at least 4 whiskeys. His cheeks were flushed, his eyes were bright, and his judgment was completely gone. That's when he decided to give an impromptu speech. The string quartet had just finished playing, and the natural lull gave Brandon his opening. He stood up at the head table, tapped his knife against his champagne flute, and waited for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying across the ballroom, "if I could have your attention for just a moment." The 180 guests turned toward him expectantly. Sarah looked nervous. "I want to talk about family tonight," Brandon began, his words slightly slurred, but still clear enough for everyone to hear. "About where we come from and where we're going." I felt a knot forming in my stomach. When I met Sarah 2 years ago, I was struck by her strength, her determination to rise above her circumstances. He gestured toward our table. "She comes from humble beginnings, working-class family, blue-collar background." A few guests nodded approvingly. This seemed like it would be a sweet speech about overcoming differences. Brandon was just getting started. Her father, Jim Anderson, represents everything that's honest and simple about America. He worked with his hands for 35 years. Construction, manual labor. Brandon's smile was condescending, even as he pretended to praise me. "Now, Jim has some interesting stories about business and real estate, don't you, Jim?" All eyes turned to me. I said nothing. "In fact," Brandon continued, his voice getting louder, "Jim here was just telling my colleagues about some property company he supposedly owns. Anderson Properties, I think it was." A murmur went through the crowd. Patricia Wells looked uncomfortable. "Now I want to be clear. There's nothing wrong with having big dreams. There's nothing wrong with wanting to impress people." Brandon's tone was becoming openly mocking now. But sometimes, when people feel insecure about their place in the world, they tell stories. They create fantasies about secret wealth and hidden success. Sarah stood up. "Brandon, stop!" "No, honey, this is important." Brandon waved her off, because what I learned tonight is that respect has to be earned, and you don't earn respect by pretending to be something you're not. The ballroom was dead silent now. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. Jim Anderson is a good man, a simple man. He built houses and raised a wonderful daughter. Brandon raised his glass toward me. But he's not a real estate mogul. He's not a secret billionaire. He's just a retired construction worker who wants to feel important at his daughter's wedding. The cruel laughter that followed was scattered but audible. And that's okay, Brandon continued. We can't all be successful in business. We can't all understand the complex financial instruments. Some of us are meant to work with our hands, and some of us are meant to work with our minds. I watched my daughter's face crumble as her husband publicly humiliated her family. So let's toast to honesty, Brandon said, raising his glass higher, to knowing our place in the world, to simple people living simple lives, and successful people building something greater. The applause was confused and reluctant. Most guests could sense that something had gone wrong, but they weren't sure what. But Brandon wasn't finished. Jim, why don't you stand up? Let everyone see the real patriarch of the Anderson family, the man who builds other people's dreams instead of his own. The mockery in his voice was unmistakable now. That's when I stood. The ballroom fell completely silent as I rose from my chair. All 180 guests were staring at me, waiting to see how the simple construction worker would respond to being publicly demolished by his son-in-law. I walked slowly to the microphone, my briefcase in hand. Brandon stepped aside with a smug smile, clearly believing he'd won some kind of victory. I adjusted the microphone and looked out at the crowd. Patricia Wells was watching intently. Sarah was fighting back tears. The other guests were leaning forward, sensing drama. Brandon makes some interesting points, I said quietly, about honesty, about knowing your place in the world. Brandon nodded approvingly. He's right that respect has to be earned, I continued. And he's right that some people work with their hands while others work with their minds. I could see Brandon relaxing, thinking I was going to meekly agree with his assessment. What Brandon doesn't know, I said, opening my briefcase, is that the best business people do both. I pulled out a manila folder and set it on the podium. These are property deeds, I announced, 38 of them, downtown Austin office buildings, purchased between 1987 and 2023. The silence was complete now. Total portfolio value, according to the most recent appraisal, $1.4 billion. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Brandon is correct about one thing. I did work construction for 35 years. I built houses, office buildings, shopping centers. I learned every aspect of real estate development from the ground up. I could see Brandon's face losing color. And then I started buying the buildings I helped construct. I pulled out another document. This is the lease agreement for 221 West 6th Street, the building where Morgan Stanley Private Wealth has their Austin offices. Patricia Wells nodded slowly. Rent, $2.3 million annually, paid by Morgan Stanley to Anderson Properties, LLC. Tenant manager, Brandon Miller. The crowd was completely still, so Brandon is absolutely right. We should know our place in the world. I looked directly at him. Your place is in my building, paying me rent, every month, for the past 2 years. Brandon's champagne glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. The silence after the champagne glass shattered lasted exactly 7 seconds. Then Patricia Wells started laughing. Not cruel laughter, not mocking laughter. The laughter of someone who suddenly understood a joke that had been building for 2 years. "Oh my God," she said, loud enough for half the ballroom to hear. "Brandon, you've been condescending to our biggest client." Brandon looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "What?" Patricia stood up, walked to the head table, and extended her hand to me. "Mr. Anderson, I owe you an apology. If I'd known who you were tonight, this entire situation could have been avoided." "No apology necessary," I said, shaking her hand. "But there is. Patricia turned to address the crowd, speaking clearly into the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Patricia Wells, Managing Director at Morgan Stanley Private Wealth. I've had the privilege of managing Anderson Properties' investment portfolio for the past 4 years. She gestured toward me with obvious respect. Mr. James Anderson is one of Austin's most successful real estate developers. His company owns more than half the downtown office space that houses Austin's major financial firms. The crowd was hanging on every word. Anderson Properties has generated over $190 million in annual rental income for the past 3 years. Mr. Anderson is, by any measure, one of Texas's most successful businessmen. Brandon was gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping him upright. He's also, Patricia continued with a slight smile, Brandon's landlord. That's when the murmurs started, wedding guests turning to each other, processing what they'd just learned. The quiet man in the corner wasn't a simple construction worker. He was the person who owned the buildings where many of them worked. But I wasn't finished. I pulled out another document from my briefcase. This is a Forbes article from September 2018. Quiet Titans, the billionaires you've never heard of. I held up the magazine page, showing the headline and my photo, the first public picture I'd ever allowed. Anderson Properties was featured as one of America's most successful private real estate companies, built without investors, without debt, without publicity. Sarah was staring at the magazine page like she was seeing a ghost. The article estimated our net worth at $1.2 billion. The actual number is now $1.4 billion. Brandon made a sound somewhere between a groan and a whimper. Now, I said, looking out at the crowd. Brandon was absolutely right about something. Respect does have to be earned. I turned to face him directly. The question is, what happens when someone shows profound disrespect to the person who's been quietly earning their respect for 40 years? Brandon tried to speak, but no words came out. Patricia Wells was watching this unfold with the fascination of someone seeing a masterclass in quiet power. For 2 years, I continued, I've listened to Brandon explain to people that Sarah comes from a modest background. I've watched him apologize for my presence at family gatherings. I've heard him tell colleagues that marrying Sarah was an act of charity. The crowd was completely captivated now. I stayed quiet because I wanted Sarah to build her own life. Because I believed in letting people show their true character. Because I thought respect would come naturally once Brandon got to know our family. Sarah was crying now, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of shame, pride, or relief. Instead, Brandon used my silence as permission to diminish everything I'd built, everything our family represents. I pulled out one final document. This is the rental agreement for the Fairmont Austin Hotel, the building where we're celebrating tonight. I held it up for everyone to see. Owned by Anderson Properties since 2021. Several guests gasped audibly. So Brandon gave his speech about knowing our place in my hotel after spending 2 years working in my office building while married to my daughter. Brandon finally found his voice. Jim, I didn't know. You didn't know because you never asked. You assumed. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning. You assumed that because I worked construction, I was uneducated. You assumed that because I drove an old truck, I was unsuccessful. You assumed that because I spoke with an accent, I was beneath you. Brandon's face was completely white now. But here's what you should have assumed, Brandon. If a man can raise a daughter like Sarah, if he can build a life that produces that kind of strength and intelligence and grace, then maybe, just maybe, there's more to that man than meets the eye. The crowd erupted in applause, but I held up my hand for silence. The tragedy here isn't that you underestimated me. The tragedy is that you've spent 2 years making my daughter apologize for where she comes from. I looked at Sarah, who was staring at me with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. Sarah Anderson is the daughter of a billionaire real estate developer, She never needed you to lift her up. She never needed you to explain her worth to anyone. She was already valuable. The applause this time was thunderous, but as the crowd clapped, I watched Brandon's expression change from shock to humiliation to something darker. Rage. And I realized that a man who could spend 2 years systematically diminishing his wife's family wasn't going to simply accept this reversal with grace. He was going to fight back, which meant the real confrontation was just beginning. Brandon's rage erupted exactly 3 minutes after the applause died down. He grabbed the microphone from my hands with shaking fingers, his face twisted with humiliation and fury. "This is bullshit," he shouted onto the microphone, his voice echoing through the ballroom. "Complete bullshit." The crowd went silent again, but this time with shock at his outburst. "You want to know the truth?" Brandon's voice was slurring worse now. "This is all fake. Documents can be forged. Business cards can be printed. This is just a pathetic old man who can't stand that his daughter married someone successful." Patricia Wells stood up. "Brandon, you need to stop." "No," he pointed an accusing finger at me. "I've worked my ass off for 10 years. I've earned everything I have. I'm not going to be humiliated by some immigrant construction worker with a briefcase full of fake papers." Sarah stood up too. "Brandon, stop it. You're drunk." "I'm drunk?" Brandon laughed bitterly. "I'm the only sober person in this room. Everyone else is falling for this ridiculous con game." He turned back to the crowd, gripping the microphone stand for support. "You want proof he's lying? Call Anderson Properties tomorrow. Ask to speak to James Anderson. See what happens. Because I guarantee you this old man has never set foot in a boardroom in his life." That's when Patricia Wells walked to the head table, opened her purse, and pulled out her phone. "Actually, Brandon," she said clearly, "I can call right now." "What?" "Anderson Properties has a 24-hour property management line for emergencies." She held up her phone. "I have the number because we handle their investment accounts." Brandon's confidence faltered. That doesn't prove anything." Patricia dialed. The phone rang through the ballroom's sound system connected to the microphone. After 2 rings, a professional voice answered, "Anderson Properties emergency line." "This is Jennifer speaking." Patricia looked directly at Brandon. "Hi, Jennifer. This is Patricia Wells from Morgan Stanley. I'm here with Mr. Anderson at a family event. Could you confirm his identity for some guests?" "Of course, Ms. Wells. Is Mr. Anderson available?" Patricia handed me her phone. "Jennifer, this is Jim. Can you tell these folks what my position is with the company?" "Certainly, Mr. Anderson. You're the founder and CEO of Anderson Properties, LLC. Would you like me to read your bio from our corporate materials?" "That would be helpful." Jennifer's voice filled the ballroom. James Anderson founded Anderson Properties in 1987 with the purchase of a single duplex in East Austin. Over 36 years, he has built the company into one of Texas's largest private real estate portfolios, encompassing 38 downtown office buildings with a combined value exceeding $1.4 billion. Brandon was staring at the phone like it was a poisonous snake. The company generates approximately $190 million in annual rental income and maintains a 97% occupancy rate. Mr. Anderson is considered one of Austin's most successful private real estate developers. "Thank you, Jennifer," I said, ending the call. The ballroom was completely silent. Brandon's mouth was opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. That's when I opened my briefcase one final time and pulled out a manila envelope. "Brandon," I said quietly, "I tried to give you a chance to apologize, to show some humility, to demonstrate that you understood the situation." His eyes were fixed on the envelope. "Instead, you doubled down. You called me a liar. You accused me of fraud. You humiliated my daughter on her wedding night." I opened the envelope and pulled out a legal document. "This is a notice of lease termination for 221 West 6th Street. Anderson Properties' legal right to terminate any lease with 90 days' notice for breach of tenant conduct standards. Brandon's face went from white to green. Effective immediately, Morgan Stanley Private Wealth has 90 days to vacate the premises. Patricia Wells gasped, "Mr. Anderson, surely we can discuss this." "I'm not terminating Morgan Stanley's lease," I said clearly. "I'm terminating it because of Brandon Miller." I pulled out another document. This is a formal complaint to Morgan Stanley's Human Resources Department, documenting Brandon's public intoxication and unprofessional conduct toward a major client. Brandon tried to grab the documents, but I moved them out of reach. "And this," I said, producing a third paper, "is a letter to the Texas Department of Banking, questioning whether someone with Brandon's judgment and impulse control should maintain a financial services license." "You can't do this," Brandon whispered. "I can, and I am." Patricia Wells was looking at Brandon with undisguised disgust. "Brandon, you've just cost our firm a $2.3 million annual lease because you couldn't control your mouth." "But it's not fair," Brandon protested. "I didn't know." "That's the point," I said. "You didn't know because you didn't care enough to find out. You made assumptions based on prejudice, and you acted on those assumptions for 2 years. I handed the termination notice to Patricia Wells. "Ms. Wells, you have 90 days to find new office space. I'll provide positive references for Morgan Stanley as a company, but Mr. Miller's employment status is your decision." Patricia folded the document and put it in her purse. "It won't take 90 days to resolve Mr. Miller's employment status." Brandon looked around the ballroom desperately, seeking support from the 180 wedding guests who had just witnessed his spectacular downfall. He found none. "Sarah," he pleaded, turning to his wife, "say something. Tell them this is crazy." Sarah looked at her husband with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, analytical, final. "I think you've said enough for both of us." The next 72 hours unfolded exactly as I'd predicted. Monday morning, Patricia Wells called an emergency meeting with Morgan Stanley's regional director. By noon, Brandon Miller's employment was terminated for conduct detrimental to client relationships and company reputation. By Tuesday, word had spread through Austin's financial community. The Austin Business Journal ran a story. Morgan Stanley, executive fired after public confrontation with billionaire client. They didn't name Brandon specifically, but everyone in the industry knew. By Wednesday, Brandon's Texas banking license was under review, and 3 headhunters who'd been courting him had stopped returning his calls. Sarah stayed with us that first week while Brandon moved out of their downtown condo. She didn't say much, just sat in the living room where she'd grown up, processing the complete destruction of everything she thought she knew about her family and her marriage. "Why didn't you tell me?" she finally asked on Thursday evening. We were sitting on the back porch, watching the sunset over the hill country, the same porch where I'd taught her to ride a bike, where we'd talked about her first job, where she'd brought Brandon for Sunday dinners for 2 years. "Your mother and I wanted you to be proud of what you built yourself." But Brandon made me feel ashamed of where I came from. "That wasn't about where you came from. That was about his character." Sarah was quiet for a long time. Then, "I should have defended you." "You were trying to keep peace in your marriage. I understand that. But it wasn't peace. It was just submission." That word hung in the air between us. "Sarah, look at me." She turned, and I saw Margaret's eyes looking back at me. Strong, intelligent, uncompromising when it mattered. "You are the daughter of Margaret and James Anderson. Your mother built our family's foundation while raising you to be independent and strong. I built our financial foundation while teaching you that work has dignity, regardless of what form it takes." Her eyes were bright with tears. "You graduated summa cum laude from UT. You landed your job at Dell on merit. You've earned every opportunity you've received. Brandon Miller didn't elevate you. He diminished you. But I let him. Because you loved him. Because you wanted your marriage to work. Because you tried to see the best in someone who wasn't worthy of your effort. I reached over and took her hand. That doesn't make you weak. That makes you generous. But generosity has limits. The next week, Sarah filed for divorce. Brandon contested it, of course. He hired Austin's most expensive divorce attorney and tried to claim that I'd interfered with his marriage and destroyed his career through false pretenses. His lawyer lasted exactly 2 days. The moment they saw the documentation of Brandon's behavior, the recorded evidence from the wedding reception, and the testimony from Patricia Wells, they withdrew from the case. Brandon ended up representing himself in mediation, where he demanded half of Sarah's family assets. Mr. Miller, the mediator explained patiently, those assets belong to Mr. Anderson. Your wife has no claim to her father's business holdings. But they were hidden. She didn't know about them. That doesn't create a marital asset. If anything, it demonstrates that Mr. Anderson deliberately kept his wealth separate from your household. Brandon walked away from the marriage with exactly what he'd brought into it. Nothing. By Christmas, Sarah had moved back to Austin permanently. Dell offered her a position in their corporate development division, with a 40% salary increase and equity participation. She bought a house in Terrytown, close enough to visit, but far enough to maintain her independence. Brandon moved to Dallas, where he eventually found work with a smaller investment firm at 60% of his previous salary. His reputation in Austin was permanently damaged, and his Texas banking license remained under review. The ripple effects continued for months. Patricia Wells reached out personally to apologize and to propose expanding our business relationship. Morgan Stanley's wealth management division now handles $500 million in Anderson Properties assets. The Forbes article from 2018 was republished online with an updated profile. This time, I agreed to an interview. Success isn't about proving yourself to people who don't respect you, I told the reporter. Success is about building something that makes their respect irrelevant. The article went viral. 3 months later, I received an invitation to speak at the University of Texas Business School about quiet leadership in real estate development. 200 students attended. Many of them were first-generation immigrants, working-class kids who looked like I had 40 years ago. Never let anyone make you apologize for where you started, I told them, and never let anyone convince you that quiet dignity is the same as weakness. After the speech, a young woman approached me. She had an accent I recognized, Irish, like mine had been 40 years ago. Mr. Anderson, I'm working construction to pay for business school. People tell me I should be ashamed of manual labor. What's your name? Katie Murphy. Katie, let me tell you something. The people who look down on honest work are usually the people who've never built anything lasting. You keep building, keep learning, keep growing. I handed her my business card. When you graduate, call me. Anderson Properties is always looking for people who understand work. 6 months later, Katie Murphy became our newest property development manager. Because the best revenge isn't destroying people who underestimate you. The best revenge is proving that their opinions never mattered in the first place. 2 years later, Sarah remarried. His name is David Wilson, a software engineer who works for a startup downtown. When she brought him to Sunday dinner for the first time, he shook my hand firmly and said, Mr. Anderson, Sarah tells me you built something incredible here. I'd love to hear about your journey sometime. No assumptions, no condescension, just genuine curiosity about our family's story. During dinner, when David asked about my transition from construction to real estate development, Sarah jumped in. Dad started with one duplex and built it into a billion-dollar company over 36 years. He's one of Austin's most successful businessmen. Her voice carried pride, not apology. That's incredible, David said. What was your biggest challenge in those early years? We talked for 2 hours about cash flow management, property acquisition strategies, and market timing. David asked thoughtful questions and listened carefully to the answers. When he left that night, he thanked Margaret and me for dinner, complimented Sarah on her family, and asked if he could come back the following week. "I like him," I told Sarah after he'd gone. "Why?" "He sees you clearly." "He sees us clearly. He doesn't need to diminish anyone to feel successful." 6 months later, David proposed, not with a speech about marrying up or humble backgrounds or different kinds of people. Just, "Sarah Anderson, you're the most intelligent, capable, generous woman I've ever met. Will you marry me?" She said yes. Their wedding was smaller than the first one, 80 guests instead of 180. David's colleagues from the startup world, Sarah's friends from Dell, and family from both sides. I walked Sarah down the aisle again, but this time her smile was different, confident, uncompromised, free. During his toast, David said, "I'm not marrying into Sarah's family. I'm joining it, and I'm honored to be part of a legacy built on hard work, integrity, and quiet strength." No one mentioned humble backgrounds or working-class origins or immigrants making good. Just a man celebrating the woman he loved and the family that shaped her. After dinner, David pulled me aside. "Mr. Anderson, I want you to know something. I'm not intimidated by your success. I'm inspired by it. That's the difference between you and the last guy." Sarah told me about Brandon, about the wedding, about everything that happened. "What did you think?" "I think he got exactly what he deserved. And I think Sarah learned something important about standing up for people she loves." David was right. Sarah had learned. She'd learned that love without respect is just enabling. She'd learned that family loyalty matters more than keeping peace. She'd learned that she didn't need anyone's permission to be proud of where she came from. These days, Sarah works in venture capital, helping startups scale their operations. She's particularly passionate about funding companies founded by immigrants and first-generation Americans. People who built something from nothing understand value, she tells her partners. They don't take success for granted. David's startup was acquired last year for $180 million. He's now CTO of the acquiring company, leading a team of 40 developers. When reporters ask about his rapid success, he always mentions his wife's family. Sarah taught me that real strength is quiet, that real power doesn't need to announce itself, that the most successful people are often the ones you'd never suspect. As for Brandon Miller, I hear he's doing fine in Dallas, married again to a woman who appreciates his stories about working in high-end real estate in Austin. I hope he's learned something from our encounter. I hope he treats his new wife's family with respect. I hope he's grown. But honestly, I don't think about Brandon Miller very much anymore. Because the most important lesson from that wedding night wasn't about revenge or consequences or proving people wrong. It was about knowing your worth, regardless of whether anyone else recognizes it. Respect isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn and lose, and sometimes, if you're very lucky, learn. On my daughter's wedding day, I handed her an envelope with a gift, hoping for gratitude. But instead of smiling, she raised her glass and said she had always dreamed of having a different father. She hugged her father-in-law, and I left the hall. But when my daughter opened the envelope, the wedding turned into a nightmare. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. $45,000. Letitia's voice cut through the pristine air of her Bloomfield Hills townhouse like a blade through silk. I stood in her designer living room, my worn cap clutched between calloused hands, feeling like a stain on her perfect white furniture. The floor-to-ceiling windows showed off manicured lawns that probably cost more to maintain than my monthly pension. Everything gleamed: glass coffee table, chrome fixtures, artwork that looked expensive enough to feed a family for months. "Tia, sweetheart, I started, but she was already spreading wedding magazines across that spotless table, each one thick as a phone book and twice as glossy. Look at this venue, Dad. She jabbed her manicured finger at a photo of some mansion with columns. The Townsend Hotel Ballroom. This is where successful people have their weddings, where my friends are getting married. My throat felt dry. I'd brought my best hopes tonight, dressed in my least faded button-down, even polished my old work boots. The drive over, I'd practiced what to say about helping with her special day. Maybe contribute a few thousand, help set up tables, whatever she needed. But 45,000? The flowers alone are 8,000, she continued, flipping pages with aggressive enthusiasm. The photographer is 5. The dress I want is 3,500, but it's perfect. You should see it. I fumbled with my phone, trying to calculate. My savings account held $12,000. Every penny I'd managed to scrape together over 40 years at the Ford plant. Social Security barely covered my mortgage and groceries. I have $12,000 in savings, I said quietly. That's everything I can manage. But maybe with a small loan. Letitia's face transformed. The excitement died, replaced by something cold and sharp. 12,000? Seriously? She stood up, her voice rising. Other fathers take out loans, sell cars, remortgage houses. What are you willing to do for your own daughter? The words hit like physical blows. I'd raised this girl after Elena died, worked double shifts so she could have new clothes for school, sacrificed everything so she could go to college and become the successful marketing professional she was today. Tia, I could try for a loan, but 45,000. I gestured helplessly around her expensive living room. You're doing well for yourself. Maybe we could find something more. More what? Cheap? She threw a magazine onto the table so hard it scattered others. You know what Marcus's father is paying for his sister's wedding? 60,000, and that's considered modest in their family. Marcus, her fiancé whose father owned half the restaurants in downtown Detroit. I'm 35 years old, Dad. This is my one chance to have the wedding I deserve. My friends' fathers would move heaven and earth for their daughters. But you? She looked me up and down, taking in my worn jacket, my nervous fidgeting. You're just a failure. The word hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. All my friends will have perfect weddings, and I have to settle for some backyard barbecue, because my father can't provide what every other parent manages. Do you know how embarrassing that is? I wanted to speak, to explain about the plant closing early, about medical bills from Elena's cancer, about doing my best with what life gave me. But my voice wouldn't come. You've had 35 years to figure out how to be successful, and this is what you have to show for it? $12,000? She walked to the door, her heels clicking on hardwood that probably cost more than my truck. Just leave, Dad. I can't look at you right now. The door slammed with a sound that seemed to echo through my chest. I stood there for a moment in her perfect driveway, keys heavy in my hand, staring at my beat-up Ford surrounded by her neighbors' luxury cars. The evening air felt thick, pressing down on my shoulders like Elena's disapproval from wherever she was watching. The truck engine ticked as it cooled in my driveway, but I couldn't bring myself to get out. Through the windshield, my house looked smaller than usual. A modest 1960s ranch with paint that needed touching up and gutters that sagged slightly on the east side. Nothing like Letitia's showcase. When I finally went inside, the silence felt heavy. I turned on the lamp by Elena's old reading chair, the one I'd never moved from its spot by the window. She used to sit there evenings planning Letitia's future, talking about college and careers and the better life our daughter would have. The photos on the mantelpiece showed happier times. Letitia's high school graduation, her college degree ceremony, family dinners when Elena was still alive. In every picture, I looked proud. Had I been fooling myself all these years? Elena, what would you do? I spoke to the empty room. Our girl deserves happiness. Maybe I really am a failure if I can't give her what she wants. 40 years at the plant, and this is what I had to show for it. $12,000 and a daughter who called me a failure to my face. I walked to the kitchen table where bills and bank statements lived in careful piles. The mortgage payment book showed 18 months left. I'd be debt-free at 70. My pension statement confirmed what I already knew. $1,800 monthly, barely enough for necessities. Social Security added another $800, But that money was already spoken for. But maybe... I picked up my phone and dialed the bank's 24-hour loan line. The automated system walked me through options until a human voice answered. "This is Jennifer. How can I help you tonight?" "Yes, I'm interested in a personal loan." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. $45,000. "I can transfer you to someone who can discuss loan options. May I have your name and social security number?" As I provided the information, I thought about Elena's reaction to such financial risk. She'd been the careful one, the planner, but she'd also been the one who said love sometimes meant taking chances that scared you. The representative explained I'd need to come in for an appointment, bring documentation, discuss terms. The words washed over me like background noise. What mattered was the possibility. Maybe I couldn't be successful the way Dennis Hargrave was successful, but I could still be the father Letitia needed. She called me a failure. Maybe she was right. But failures don't love their daughters enough to risk everything. I found Elena's favorite tea in the kitchen cupboard, still there after 3 years. The smell brought back memories of her saying, "Dewey, that girl is our greatest achievement. Whatever it takes to see her happy." Tomorrow, I'd go to the bank. Tonight, I'd plan how to surprise Letitia with the full amount, plus my original savings. Maybe then she'd see that her old man wasn't quite finished yet. The alarm clock went off at 6:30 the next morning, but I'd been awake for hours. Chase Bank on Woodward Avenue looked more intimidating at 10 in the morning than it had any right to. Glass and steel reaching toward cloudy Detroit skies, security cameras tracking every movement, the kind of building where important financial decisions happen to important people. I straightened my best button-down shirt and checked the folder containing my documentation, pension statements, Social Security papers, 40 years of steady employment history. Elena's voice whispered in my memory, "Stand tall, Dewey. You're as good as anyone." The lobby bustled with activity. Young professionals in expensive suits handled transactions that probably involved more money than I'd see in a lifetime. I took my place in line behind a woman discussing investment portfolios with casual confidence. "Next!" The loan officer, a professional woman around Letitia's age, gestured me toward her desk. Her nameplate read, "Sandra Williams, Personal Banking." "Mr. Gomez, please have a seat. I understand you're interested in a personal loan?" "Yes, ma'am. $45,000. It's for my daughter's wedding." Sandra's fingers clicked across her keyboard, pulling up my financial profile. Her expression remained neutral as numbers populated her screen. "I see you're retired from Ford Motor Company. 40 years of service, that's impressive. Your pension and Social Security provide steady income." She paused, reviewing details. "However, given your age and income level, there are some limitations we need to discuss." My chest tightened. "What kind of limitations?" "The maximum we can approve is $35,000. The interest rate would be 18% annually due to your age and fixed income situation." She turned her monitor toward me, showing calculations that made my head spin. "Are you certain about this commitment, Mr. Gomez?" 18%. I tried to calculate what that meant for monthly payments, but the numbers felt overwhelming. "Yes, I understand the risks. This is for my daughter." Sandra pulled out forms, her voice taking on a careful, professional tone. "The total repayment amount will be $52,000 over 5 years. Your monthly payment would be approximately $870. $870. More than half my pension. She's worth every penny. Where do I sign?" The paperwork took an hour. Credit checks, identity verification, explanations of terms and conditions that felt like warnings. Other customers came and went, handling routine transactions while I made a decision that would change everything. Sandra explained the loan's impact on my budget with the kind of gentle concern reserved for senior citizens making questionable financial choices. But she processed the application anyway, because the numbers barely worked. The credit approval came through faster than expected. Sandra printed documents, had me initial each page, explained payment schedules and late fee policies. The fluorescent lighting made everything feel clinical and serious, like signing away more than just money. "The funds will be available immediately as a cashier's check," Sandra said, sliding the document across her desk. "Mr. Gomez, I want to make sure you understand. This loan will significantly impact your monthly budget. I looked at the check. $35,000, plus my $12,000 in savings. $47,000 total, more than Letitia had demanded. Thank you, I said, tucking the check carefully into my jacket pocket. My daughter will be so surprised. Walking to my truck, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the pride of solving an impossible problem through sheer determination. Maybe I was just a factory worker, but I could still provide for my girl. The system had tried to stop me with age restrictions and income limitations, but love had found a way. I drove toward Bloomfield Hills with the cashier's check burning like hope in my pocket, already imagining Letitia's face when I handed her more money than she'd even asked for. The envelope felt heavier than it should as I rang Letitia's doorbell 2 hours later. Through the glass panels, I could see her approaching in comfortable home clothes, yoga pants and an oversized sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Dad? She opened the door with mild surprise. What are you doing here? I stepped inside, practically bouncing with nervous excitement. The living room looked different somehow. More wedding magazines scattered across surfaces, expensive-looking vendor cards arranged like playing cards on the coffee table. Tia, sweetheart. I pulled the envelope from my jacket with ceremonial care. I took out a loan. Here's your $47,000 for the dream wedding. Her reaction wasn't what I expected. No gasp of joy, no grateful tears. Instead, she stared at the envelope like it was homework she'd forgotten about. Oh, Dad. Her voice carried a strange mixture of pity and annoyance. That's not needed anymore. Dennis is paying for the whole wedding. He said I deserve the best? The words hit like cold water. I stood there, arm extended, holding money that had cost me everything. But I took a loan at 18%. Well, just return it then. She waved her hand dismissively, already turning back toward her magazines. Dennis is doing this out of love for Marcus. Finally, someone understands I'm worth better than bargain shopping. Worth better, the phrase echoed in my head as I watched her flip through pages of expensive venues and designer dresses, all paid for by someone else's generosity. When did Dennis offer? I managed to ask. Yesterday afternoon. He called right after. She paused, realizing what she was about to say. Right after we talked, he said no daughter-in-law of his would settle for anything less than perfection. Yesterday afternoon. While I was at home, beating myself up for being a failure, planning to sacrifice my financial future, Dennis Hargrave had swooped in with his effortless wealth and made me irrelevant. Look at this venue! Letitia held up a glossy photo, her enthusiasm returning. The Townsend Hotel Grand Ballroom. Dennis booked it for the whole weekend. And this photographer, she did the governor's daughter's wedding last year. I pulled the envelope back to my chest, feeling foolish for ever thinking $47,000 was impressive to people who lived in this world. The flowers alone will be $12,000, she continued, not noticing my silence. Dennis said cost shouldn't matter when it comes to making me happy. Isn't that wonderful? Wonderful. Yes, it was wonderful that someone understood her worth. Someone who wasn't a retired factory worker living on a pension. Dad, are you okay? You look pale. Just tired, I lied, tucking the envelope back into my jacket. I should go return this to the bank. Good idea. No point in paying interest on money you don't need. She was already back to her magazines, planning a wedding funded by someone else's love. I walked to the door, my footsteps echoing in the pristine hallway. Behind me, I could hear her humming as she turned pages, completely absorbed in dreams that no longer required my sacrifice. Thanks for thinking of me, though, she called out as I reached for the handle. It's sweet that you tried. Sweet that I tried. Like a child's attempt at helping adults with real work. I sat in my truck for 10 minutes before starting the engine, staring at her house through windows that reflected nothing but my own confused face. 3 miles from Letitia's neighborhood, I had to pull over. My hands were shaking too badly to steer safely, and the envelope in my jacket felt like it was burning through the fabric. 40 years I gave her everything, and to her I'm just a backup plan, easily replaced by someone with deeper pockets. The parking lot of a closed auto parts store seemed appropriate. Empty, forgotten, like everything I thought I meant to my daughter. I turned off the engine and let the silence wash over me. Elena, What would you say about our girl now? Would you still call her our girl if you saw how easily she dismissed 40 years of love? The drive home felt longer than usual. Detroit's industrial landscape rolled past my windows. Empty lots where factories used to stand, boarded up houses, the remnants of people who'd worked hard and got left behind. People like me. But first, I had business to handle. Sandra looked surprised when I walked back into Chase Bank 30 minutes before closing. Mr. Gomez, is everything all right? I need to cancel the loan. Early repayment penalty, whatever it costs. Her professional smile flickered with concern. Are you sure? We just processed this today. The penalty for early repayment is $500. I'll pay it. I don't need this loan. The paperwork took 15 minutes. Sandra kept glancing at me like she wanted to ask questions, but banking professionals knew when to mind their business. I signed forms, watched her process the cancellation, and handed back the cashier's check that had briefly represented my heroic sacrifice. Your checking account will be debited for the penalty fee by tomorrow, she explained, sliding a receipt across her desk. $500 for the privilege of being humiliated. Money well spent. At home, the silence felt different. Not heavy like before, but clean somehow. I made Elena's favorite tea and sat in her reading chair, looking at the photos on the mantelpiece with new eyes. There was Letitia's high school graduation. In the picture, she was hugging me tight, whispering, "Thank you for everything, Dad. I couldn't have done this without you." College graduation. You made this possible. I'll never forget what you sacrificed for me. When had gratitude turned into entitlement? When had my love become something she managed rather than treasured? Maybe it's time I stopped begging for crumbs of appreciation from my own daughter. The wedding invitation sat on my kitchen table. Elegant cream cardstock with gold lettering. The honor of your presence is requested. Honor. What an interesting word choice. I picked up the phone to call Letitia, then set it down. Tomorrow would be soon enough. Tonight, I needed to think about what kind of father I wanted to be for whatever relationship we had left. The tea was Elena's blend, chamomile and mint. She used to say it helped her think clearly. I sipped it slowly, watching the evening light fade through windows that needed cleaning, in a house that needed repairs I couldn't afford since giving away my savings. But somehow, for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The next morning came with unusual clarity. Instead of calling Letitia immediately like I usually did, I made coffee and read the newspaper cover to cover. When my phone rang at 8:30, I let it go to voicemail. "Dad, call me back. We need to discuss your outfit for the engagement party." Engagement party. This was the first I'd heard of it. I called her back 3 hours later. "Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you." "Reading? What's this about an engagement party?" "Saturday night at Dennis's club. Nothing too formal, but..." Her voice shifted to that careful tone I'd started recognizing. "Actually, maybe it's better if you sit this one out. Dennis's friends will be there, and you understand. They're used to a certain level. Like I was a step on a staircase she was climbing past. What level is that, Tia? Well, you know, professional people, business owners. They might not relate to..." She trailed off, letting me fill in the blanks about my inadequacy. "To a retired factory worker? Don't be like that. It's just easier this way." Easier? Everything about our relationship had become about what was easier for her. 3 weeks into April, the pattern became clear. Wedding planning meetings I wasn't invited to. Vendor consultations scheduled when I was probably busy. A growing list of events where my presence would be awkward for people who mattered more than I did. By early May, our phone conversations followed a script. She'd call with demands disguised as requests. I'd offer help that wasn't sophisticated enough, and she'd find polite ways to exclude me from anything important. The dress-fitting invitation came with conditions. "You can come, but please don't talk too much. And wear something nice. Actually, do you even have anything appropriate?" I wore my best shirt and tie to the bridal salon in downtown Birmingham. The place looked like a jewelry store, all marble and crystal, with dresses displayed like precious artifacts. Letitia's friends were already there. 3 women in designer clothes discussing their own upcoming weddings with casual mentions of photographers who charged more than my annual income. "Ladies, this is my father." Letitia's introduction carried an apologetic undertone. He's very simple, but he means well. Simple. The word hung in the perfumed air like a judgment. I stood in the corner while they discussed dress alterations and reception details, feeling like museum security. Present, but invisible. There to watch, but not participate. Your father's sweet, one of them whispered to Letitia, loud enough for me to hear. It's nice that you include him. Include him. Like I was charity work. That night, I drove to Woodlawn Cemetery for the first time since Elena's birthday. Her grave was simple, a modest headstone with her name and dates, surrounded by the daisies I'd planted 3 years ago. Elena, I can't live like this anymore. I knelt beside the stone, pulling weeds from around the flowers. She needs to know the truth. The cemetery was quiet, except for traffic from 8 Mile Road. I'd always found peace here, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like a decision. You remember what the social worker said? Someday she might want to know about her real parents. Well, maybe someday is now. I drove home slowly, stopping at the drugstore for writing supplies. The letter took 6 attempts, each draft torn up and thrown away until I found words that felt right. The final version was simple, direct, true. When I sealed it in an envelope 2 days later, my hands were steady. The wedding invitation sat next to it on my kitchen table, and I noticed something that made my chest tighten. The ceremony time listed was different from what Letitia had told me. 2 hours different. I stared at the invitation until the numbers blurred, understanding exactly what my daughter thought of my importance to her special day. St. Paul Church looked magnificent in the May afternoon sun, its Gothic stone towers reaching toward cloudless skies. I pulled into the parking lot at 12:55, checking my invitation one final time. 1 o'clock ceremony. I'd timed everything perfectly. The organ music drifted through the heavy wooden doors as I approached the church steps. Strange. They must be playing prelude music longer than usual. I straightened my tie, the same black one I'd worn to Elena's funeral, and climbed toward the entrance. Excuse me, are you going in? A woman in an expensive navy dress hurried past me. We're so late. Late? I checked my watch. 12:58. More guests streamed toward the church doors, their faces showing the mild panic of people arriving after something had already started. Through the thick oak doors I could hear not just organ music, but voices, the ritualistic call and response of a ceremony in progress. Oh, you're late too? An older gentleman in a charcoal suit paused beside me, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief. The ceremony started at noon. Traffic on the lodge was terrible. My hand froze on the church door handle. Noon? Mine says 1 o'clock. He pulled out his invitation, cream cardstock identical to mine, except for one crucial detail. 12 o'clock, he read, then looked at my invitation with genuine confusion. That's strange. Are you family? The word stuck in my throat. I'm the bride's father. His eyebrows rose with sympathy and embarrassment. Oh, I thought that distinguished gentleman with the gray hair was her father, the one who walked her down the aisle. The distinguished gentleman with gray hair. Dennis. I compared our invitations side by side. His showed 12 p.m. in elegant script. Mine showed 1 p.m. in identical lettering. Both printed professionally, both appearing authentic, except mine had been deliberately altered to exclude me from the most important moment of my daughter's life. Probably just a printing error, the man said kindly, but his eyes showed he understood the implications. Through the stained glass windows I could see the ceremony in progress. Letitia in white, radiant at the altar, Marcus beside her in his tuxedo, and there in the front pew where I should have been sitting, Dennis Hargrave occupied the place of honor, reserved for the father of the bride, the father who had walked her down the aisle, the father who had given her away, the father who mattered. I stood on those stone steps, invitation trembling in my hand, understanding that 35 years of fatherhood had been erased with a simple printing change, reduced from the man who would proudly walk his daughter down the aisle to an unwanted afterthought arriving too late to matter. The other guests had gone inside, leaving me alone with the weight of complete betrayal, not just excluded from the ceremony, deliberately deceived to ensure my absence from the moment that should have been mine by right. I folded the invitation carefully and walked back toward my truck, but stopped at the small park across the street. The sealed envelope in my jacket pocket felt heavier now, its contents no longer a last resort, but a necessity. Some truths could no longer wait for a convenient moment. The park bench offered a clear view of St. Paul Church, where late guests continued hurrying inside to catch what remained of the ceremony. I sat with the envelope in my hands, watching their expensive cars fill the parking lot, understanding finally that I had never belonged in Letitia's new world. 35 years of lies is enough. Time for her to learn the truth. I opened the original envelope I'd brought as a wedding gift, the one that had once contained $47,000 in desperate sacrifice. Empty now except for the letter I'd written during those long nights in May, when sleep wouldn't come, and Elena's memory whispered that some secrets were crueler than the truth. The handwritten pages felt substantial in my hands. 4 sheets of careful cursive, telling the story Letitia had never heard, about the phone call that changed everything, about a 16-year-old girl who couldn't keep her baby, about Elena and me, unable to have children, being offered a miracle we'd never expected. My dear Tia, the letter began, there are things you must know before you begin your new life. Things about who you really are and what you've lost today by choosing strangers over the man who raised you as his own. I folded the pages back into the wedding envelope, sealing it with the kind of finality that couldn't be undone. The money I'd originally planned to give her went back into my wallet. I was done being her financial resource. This gift would cost her something far more valuable than money. Elena, forgive me, but she needs to know what she really lost today. The church bells began their announcement that the ceremony was ending. Through the stained glass windows, I could see movement as the wedding party prepared for their triumphant exit. Soon they would move to the reception area, where guests would offer congratulations and presents, where I would blend in like any other guest, carrying my gift with patience and purpose. I stood from the bench, brushing dust from my suit, the same dark suit I'd worn to Elena's funeral, to Letitia's college graduation, to every important moment of our life together. Today it would serve one final purpose. My reflection in my phone's camera showed a man I barely recognized, not the desperate father who'd begged for scraps of appreciation, but someone who understood his own worth, someone who would no longer accept being diminished. The envelope felt light in my hand as I crossed the street toward the church. Behind me, the park bench sat empty, marking the spot where Dewey Gomez, the victim, had died, and someone else entirely had taken his place. The church doors opened as I approached, and the first wedding guests began emerging into the sunshine, their faces glowing with celebration. I joined the stream of well-wishers, moving with purpose toward the reception area. It was time to give my daughter the wedding gift she truly deserved. The reception area hummed with celebration as I entered, my envelope held casually at my side. Guests clustered around linen-covered tables, champagne glasses catching afternoon light through tall windows. The scent of expensive flowers filled the air, roses and lilies that probably cost more than my monthly pension. Letitia stood in the receiving line, resplendent in her wedding gown, greeting guests with the radiant smile I remembered from her childhood. Marcus beside her, Dennis hovering nearby like a proud patriarch, accepting congratulations for his generosity. I moved through the crowd purposefully but calmly, other guests parting respectfully when they realized I was approaching the bride. The father of the bride, finally arriving to offer his blessing. "Dad!" Letitia's face showed genuine relief, mixed with nervous energy. "You came? I was worried when you weren't in the church. Sorry about the time confusion. Probably just a printing error." Her voice carried that practiced lightness she used when managing embarrassing situations, as if my exclusion from walking her down the aisle was merely an unfortunate mistake rather than a calculated insult. "Of course," I replied smoothly, stepping forward with my envelope. "Just an error. Congratulations to you and Marcus." I presented the envelope with both hands, my voice taking on unusual gravity. "Tia, I want you to have this gift. It's very important." Something in my tone made her actually look at me, really look, for the first time in months. The envelope appeared ordinary enough, cream-colored like all wedding gift envelopes, but my serious expression gave her pause. "Thank you, Dad. That's so sweet of you." "Sweet. the same dismissive words she'd used when I'd tried to sacrifice everything for her happiness. Dewey! Dennis approached with his arms extended, playing the gracious host. Finally, we meet properly. Letitia has told me so much about you. I turned to face the man who had replaced me, offering my hand with steady composure. I'm sure she has. You've been very generous to our family. Nothing's too good for my new daughter, Dennis beamed, his arms settling around Letitia's shoulders with casual ownership. She deserves the very best. The very best. Which apparently didn't include the man who had raised her. Dad, let me introduce you to some friends, Letitia said, already turning toward other guests. She handed my envelope to Marcus absently. Put this with the other gifts, honey. I watched the letter disappear into Marcus's hands, then get placed on the gift table among dozens of other presents. Somewhere in that pile of ribbon and wrapping paper sat the truth that would change everything. Such a beautiful ceremony, a guest commented to me. You must be so proud. Yes, I replied, my eyes following Letitia as she moved through the reception, accepting congratulations and praise. Very proud of how everything turned out. The photographer moved through the crowd, capturing moments of joy and celebration. I wondered if he'd photographed the gift-giving moment, preserving forever the instant when justice disguised itself as love. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and found a place among the other guests, watching and waiting. Letitia was absorbed in her role as bride, greeting relatives and friends, basking in attention and admiration. The envelope sat unopened on the gift table, patient as a ticking clock. Soon enough, she would understand what it meant to lose a father who truly loved her. Soon enough, she would learn the difference between the man who had chosen to raise her and the stranger who had simply written a check. I sipped my champagne and smiled at fellow guests, playing the part of the proud father one final time. Crystal glasses chimed like wedding bells as guests gathered in a semicircle around the newlyweds. The Renaissance Center's floor-to-ceiling windows framed Detroit's skyline in golden afternoon light, creating the perfect backdrop for Letitia's moment of triumph. Everyone, please! She raised her champagne flute high, her voice carrying across the reception hall with practiced confidence. I want to thank everyone who made this day possible. The photographer positioned himself to capture her radiant smile, the designer gown catching light like spun silk. Around me, guests turned their attention toward the bride, faces expectant and warm. Especially Dennis, Letitia continued, her eyes finding him in the crowd. You've shown me what it means to have a father who truly cares. I've always wanted a different father, and finally, that dream has come true. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. The comfortable murmur of celebration died into shocked silence. I felt every eye in the room flicker toward me, then quickly away. Some guests stared at their shoes. Others found sudden interest in the floral arrangements. The photographer's camera clicked, preserving the moment for eternity. Dennis, you're the father I never had. Letitia beamed, walking toward him with arms extended. Thank you for showing me what real generosity looks like. Dennis embraced her with obvious pleasure, accepting the role she'd thrust upon him. His smile was triumphant as he held his new daughter, completely comfortable with replacing a man who'd devoted 35 years to raising her. Letitia, you're the daughter I never had, he replied loud enough for everyone to hear. Around us, the silence stretched uncomfortably. A few guests attempted polite applause, but it died quickly when they realized the cruelty of what they'd witnessed. Others whispered behind hands, their faces showing the kind of second-hand embarrassment that comes from watching someone humiliate themselves publicly. I stood perfectly still, champagne glass steady in my hand, watching my daughter embrace her replacement father while dismissing 3.5 decades of love as inadequate. No anger showed on my face, no hurt, just the calm understanding that this was exactly who she'd always been, and I'd finally stopped pretending otherwise. The gift table sat 20 feet away, my envelope buried among expensive presents from Dennis's wealthy friends. Soon enough, she'd discover what her cruel words had cost her. I set my champagne glass on a nearby table and walked quietly toward the exit. No dramatic scene, no confrontation. Just a dignified man removing himself from a situation where his presence was clearly unwanted. Behind me, the reception gradually resumed its celebration, guests pretending they hadn't witnessed a daughter publicly disowning the man who'd raised her. The photographer continued capturing moments of joy, though several guests requested he delete the toast sequence. I pushed through the heavy doors into the parking garage, my footsteps echoing in the concrete space. The envelope with adoption papers waited patiently among wedding gifts, ready to teach Letitia the difference between wanting a different father and discovering you never had the one you thought you did. My truck started on the first try, reliable as always. I drove through Detroit's late afternoon traffic with unusual peace, watching familiar neighborhoods roll past my windows. 35 years of fatherhood were ending not with tears or anger, but with the quiet satisfaction of a job finally completed. At home, I moved through the rooms with purpose, selecting what mattered for the life ahead. Elena's wedding ring went into my shirt pocket. Our photo from Letitia's college graduation, back when gratitude still lived in her eyes, found space in my travel bag. My work tools, earned through decades of honest labor, deserved better than gathering dust while I begged for crumbs of appreciation. The phone started ringing at 4:30. "Dad, we're opening gifts now," Letitia's voice bubbled with champagne excitement. "Some of these presents are incredible. Marcus's aunt gave us crystal from Ireland." I let it ring through to voicemail, continuing my methodical packing. The second call came 10 minutes later. "Dad, are you there? We found your envelope. What kind of gift needs to be opened privately?" The third call arrived as I folded my best shirt, the one I'd worn to her wedding, thinking I'd be walking her down the aisle. Her voice had changed by then, uncertainty creeping through the celebration. "Dad, I read your letter. This isn't funny. Call me back immediately." By the fourth call, panic had replaced confusion. "Dad, this can't be true. You're lying. Call me right now." I unplugged the phone and continued sorting through 35 years of memories, keeping only what served the future. The house felt different already, lighter somehow, as if removing the weight of obligation had made the walls themselves stand straighter. My phone buzzed constantly against the kitchen counter. 20 missed calls. 30. 44. Through voicemails, I listened to Letitia's voice crack as she processed the truth she'd never suspected. Adopted at 3 years old after her parents died in a car accident. Raised by strangers who'd chosen to love her. 35 years of lies, not malicious deception, but the kind of protective love that shields children from painful truths until they're old enough to understand. "You're not my real father? Then who am I? Where do I come from?" Real father. Even in crisis, she couldn't recognize the difference between biology and choice, between conception and raising a child with unconditional love. "Dad, please, I didn't mean what I said at the reception. Come back." But she had meant it. That was the problem. I loaded my truck as sunset painted the sky orange and pink, Elena's favorite colors. The missed calls had reached 51 by the time I backed out of the driveway, taking one last look at the modest house where we'd raised someone else's daughter as our own. The adoption papers in that envelope told the whole story. Names of birth parents who'd died too young, details of the accident that orphaned her. The joy Elena and I felt when social services called about a little girl who needed love. Letitia had spent the day choosing money over loyalty, status over sacrifice. Now she could live with the consequences of preferring strangers to the man who'd chosen to be her father when biology failed her. I-75 stretched south like a ribbon of possibilities, Detroit's skyline shrinking in my rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely. The radio played Sinatra, My Way, while evening light painted Michigan farmland in shades of gold and peace. 53 missed calls by the time I reached the Ohio border. I turned the phone off completely. "Elena," I spoke to her photo on the dashboard, "I finally did what needed doing. 35 years I gave love to an ungrateful child. Time to live for myself." The truck hummed contentedly at 65 miles per hour, carrying me toward whatever came next. Cincinnati, maybe, or Louisville. Somewhere warm where winter wouldn't hurt these old bones, where no one knew my story or expected me to justify my choices. Small towns rolled past my windows, places where people understood the value of honest work and reciprocated kindness. places where a 68-year-old retired mechanic could start fresh without apologizing for his limitations or begging for respect. My thermos held Elena's favorite coffee blend, bitter but warming. The road atlas lay open on the passenger seat, marked with possible destinations circled in red ink. Planning felt good after years of simply reacting to Letitia's demands and disappointments. "Letitia, you wanted a different father," I said to the darkening highway. "Now you have one. I hope Dennis is everything you dreamed he'd be." The adoption revelation would destroy her perfect wedding narrative. No more bragging about her generous new father figure. No more casual cruelty toward the man who'd changed her diapers, taught her to ride a bike, worked double shifts to pay for her college education. Instead, she'd face questions about identity and belonging that money couldn't answer. Who was she really? Where did she come from? What had she lost by choosing wealth over love? Dennis Hargrave could buy her expensive weddings and designer gowns, but he couldn't give her back 35 years of genuine devotion. He couldn't explain bedtime stories or homework help or proud moments at graduations. He couldn't replace the foundation of unconditional love she'd just discovered was built by choice, not obligation. The highway signs counted down miles to new possibilities. Toledo, Dayton, places where I could be just Dewey Gomez, not the disappointing father of an ungrateful daughter. My truck's headlights carved through gathering darkness as I drove toward whatever tomorrow would bring. Behind me, Detroit held nothing I needed anymore. Ahead lay freedom I'd forgotten was possible. The phone stayed silent in my pocket, its 53 unanswered calls becoming ancient history with every mile. Letitia had made her choice long before today. The adoption letter simply helped her understand the full cost of choosing strangers over the man who'd chosen to love her when the world left her orphaned and alone. I was 68 years old, maybe 20 good years left, maybe more. They belonged to me now. The radio played late-night classics as I drove into my new beginning. Elena's photo catching dashboard, light like a blessing. Behind us lay 3 decades of sacrifice. Ahead stretched possibility and peace. Finally, I was free. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching,